A Cricketing View, an irregular podcast about cricket and other things. Hello and welcome to a new episode of a Cricketing View podcast. My guest today is Tim Wigmore. He's here to talk about a book he's written about how elite athletes are made. Welcome back, Tim. It's great to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
So this is your third book, right, Tim?
Yeah, but they're all half books, so count it as 1.5 books rather than 3, I think.
So your co-author in this book is Mark Williams, who's the leading sports scientist, who's in demand across sports, not just football. And as I understand, he was famously invited by the Brazilians after the 2014 World Cup. Am I right in thinking that, or is that just something I read on the internet?
No, that's right. Yeah, they invited him to give some advice on how to improve code, so on.
So how did the idea of doing this book come about?
So it was sort of Mark wanted for a while to do something that was kind of, in some ways, a kind of a distillation of his lifetime's work. And then he sort of taught, and then we got in touch. We were introduced by Matthew Saeed kindly, and then we were introduced, and then sort of it's a case of chatting to Mark and working trying to get that into a proposal, and the idea really was to rather than this just be an academic book, to write it as a popular science book. So, doing lots of original interviews and stuff and having a narrative and everything. So, yeah, it's sort of, it's about the, what makes elite athletes. And we tell that through, individual stories and then the kind of, and weaving in the science in and around that.
Yes, I quite enjoyed the way the book is constructed as a combination of a survey of the state of the art in the literature and in the professions of psychology and sports science, and then and even in some cases developmental psychology in part 1 of the book, and then with actual interviews of some of the greatest players in so many different sports. So, I mean, there are lots of interesting subjects in this book, but basically you've organized it in 3 parts. Basically, part one is what I would call your nature versus nurture debate broadly. Part 2 is about all the interesting stuff which animates Twitter conversations, but done in a very scholarly way. It deals with choking, and it deals with clutch plays and important what differentiates the great player from the good player. And part 3 is about training and preparation and why things are advancing. So I want to actually start with a sort of a synoptic question. Which is that in the book, there's this idea that the elite level of sport is becoming more elite with each generation, right? So, for instance, the degree of basic physical characteristics required to be a great sprinter today are different from and more specialized than what they were, say, 50 years ago, right? So can you talk about that, and can you talk about what that how that shapes what it means to be elite today as opposed to, in our parents' generation?
Yeah, look, I think that's really interesting, and that's right. I think what we're seeing, obviously athletes are more professional than ever. Scouting and talent ID is more advanced than ever. So athletes are giving themselves the best possible chance. And obviously the finances in elite sport also means that, a kid now is going to try and, more kids anyway will try and give being professional, they're absolute everything. Whereas a few generations ago, those incentives were not nearly as strong. And in a lot of sports, in the Olympic sports,
Yeah.
they had to be athletes had to be amateurs, so they wouldn't make any money at all. So effectively, you had sport being limited to those who could afford to do it. Now that's not the case. So sport has become more democratic. It's opened up, and therefore, probably more people. People want to say that that there's sort of a saying that more people probably aspire to be as good at life Messi is at his thing than have aspired to do anything in history. I think that's possibly is true. So sport is incredibly competitive, and it's insane. We have, if you kind of look at the numbers of kids who are doing sport, and how few of them become elite. There's some incredible stats. So
Yes.
one every 12,000 children who play basketball, they go on to be professional,
Yes.
and that's just being professional, not being the absolute best of the sport. In England, only 180 out of 1.5 million players who play organised football each year go on to play in the Premier League. So that's a success rate of 0.01%. So it's phenomenally difficult to get there.
And it's also that enormous resources are being invested in this across the world in small ways and big ways, like right from the investment in neighborhoods and neighborhood sporting facilities to a place like Britain where millions and millions in lottery money goes to specifically preparing Olympic level competitors. And one interesting thing I'd like to tease out here is what this is doing to the gap between like the very top sportsmen and the enthusiasts. And increasingly it seems to me that that gap is sort of widening beyond comprehension. Is that fair, or is that just my perception?
No, that's spot on, because the resources being given to those at the top are bigger than ever before. Improvements in things like diet, in sleep, in kind of analytics, they're massive and giving athletes such an important advantage. So actually, the gap between your kind of good local recreational player and your good professional, let alone uber elite player, is I think that's risen, and it will continue to rise, because the time and resources spent to basically help those at the top extract every iota of their talent. So it's becoming elite sport compared to good recreational sport. It's becoming more and more distinct, really. And even even the gap, I'd argue, between lowly professional and high professional, for example, in football, that is getting higher and higher. And also, just I think actually one funny way of thinking about it, but the kind of level of performance an elite the top athletes produce on their bad days, it seems to me like that variability has got so much less than it used to be, that even on their worst days, they are still delivering a certain level of performance. And actually everything has been done. The reason you have these personalized sleep programs, personalized starts and so on, it's all to take out that variability, to remove as far as possible that kind of a chance in how someone will perform on a given day. And actually with Team GB, UK Sport, a lot of what they were doing, that their work it's tailored years out on how an athlete peak at the Olympics. And actually they credit a lot of their success with the number of athletes who produce their year's best being in the Olympic Games, and that's risen massively. So it's actually a level of understanding what it takes, not just to improve performance, but to peak when it matters the most as well.
I mean, and it's becoming something that, like, it's not just that I want you to be the best athlete you can be, or the best footballer you can be, or the best. It's that I want you to prepare so that if you're a footballer, you're at your very best in March and April and May, right? And that if you're an Olympic athlete, your trajectory is designed so that you're peaking right at when the Olympics are. So it's sort of a very, I mean, the goal orientation is one way to put it, but I mean, this seems to be something uh, that there seems to be an element of commodification in this, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think this creates problems as well, because in some ways the athletes are kind of they can almost be kind of reduced to a kind of a data point rather than a human being. That's always the danger, isn't it? That
Yes.
they're just kind of cogs in this huge machine, and I think that's we're seeing more and more. Athletes talk about their mental health problems and so on, and I don't think those are going to go away. Even though more now is being done on that, but ultimately, what is necessary to reach and maintain these levels of performance is asking a massive amount. It's beyond the scope of most of us, even if we had the talent, just to be able to put in those levels of commitment and maintain them year after year.
And this is especially unique to sport, right? Because let's face it. I mean, unlike if you want to be a doctor or an engineer or an architect or a lawyer, what you do at the age of 7 or 8 is probably not that important, right? But if you want to be an Olympic athlete, or if you ever have a chance to be anywhere close to being an Olympic level athlete, or you want to play Test cricket, or you want to play, in the Premier League, or you want to play for England, uh, it's unthinkable to do that if you start at 17 or 18, right? So these are people who have already, I mean, their entire life is very different from, say, yours or mine, isn't it? By the time they're 30.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose this gets us into the debate on specialization, which is one of the
Yes,
issues we're addressing in the book. And
that's what I was going to get to.
And I think the idea, so all the evidence that we've accumulated, it suggests that the idea you have to, specialize when you're 10, 11, that is not true. And in many ways, it can be counterproductive and dangerous. You see athletes who specialize earlier are more likely to suffer from burnout. They're more likely to suffer from injury because of overuse, and mental health issues. So early specialization, you see it ridiculously. You see kids age 9 or 10 being told to play other sports. That's ridiculous. But it is also true that to reach the pinnacle in most sports, especially sports which are more mass participation, and have a kind of more variability to them. So you'd look at a sport like football or basketball or cricket, even has high variability. You need to practice. So there's a lot of kind of the value of game intelligence and stuff is big, and you can reach the top in lots of different ways, i.e. the relative importance of physique is a bit less than in a sport like rowing, where physical attributes are so important that, and also it's not. We talked with Helen Glover, who won an Olympic medal gold after she'd done it about 4,000 hours in her entire life, and she didn't start rowing until the age of 21. So clearly, specialization is not always necessary. But But there was nothing like Helen Glover's story in football. It's not really, not really in cricket, or a kid someone not playing until they're 20 and then going on to be elite. So, as you said, future elite athletes, sport generally is a massive part of their childhood, and actually as well, often the hours they might spend a lot of hours across a variety of sports, and those, I believe that hours spent in other sports still tend to help an athlete in their primary sport, because it's still developing their motor skills. It's still very good for their psychological skills as well. And actually, I think often for kids who are very, very good and dominant in one sport, there's a huge value playing a game where they're not always the best, because it forces them to develop skills and kind of mental strength that they then need later on in their journey. Because actually, if you're just beating up on other kids, well, after a while, that sort of stunts your skill development, because you're not being exposed to these new challenges, and you're not being actually forced to develop to keep up. And in fact, it's the importance of kind of playing with people who are bigger than you, better than you, that helps to explain why younger siblings have a big advantage in sport, as we talk about in our first chapter.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things about in your discussion of what you call diversification is this idea that not only does diversification help with acquiring skills, ultimately becoming better at your primary sport, but it also helps you psychologically, because it sort of puts you in many different competitive situations, and it gets you used to losing, and that, it seems, is a really important developmental developmental stage. Learning how to lose, learning how to compete, those.
And learning how to actually have a defeat, and how to kind of analyze that defeat and learn from it. Yeah. Again, people say you learn more from failure. It's a cliche, but it is true. And so that ability to kind of take a defeat, to kind of diagnose it, and then to work on that the next time. And that is such an important thing for children to gain in their sports. And so if you're, so a good example of some athletes who don't get this is if you're old for your year and you're kind of physically developed as well. So both that you're 10, 11 months older than other kids in your team, and you've grown earlier anyway, so you have this sort of double advantage. Then you have been in a position where you're probably bigger than your teammates and opponents. You're probably stronger than them as well. So whether this is football, you can outrun them. In cricket, you can smash the ball further, whatever. Which is great for you up to a point, but actually that's not going to develop your skills particularly quickly. And actually, you don't need to develop those other skills. You don't need to develop the psychological skills. And so we talk about the relative age effect in sport, which is it's quite well known, but what's not well known really is the underdog effect that we talk about, which is of super elite athletes, the very, very best, ones who win MVP awards and so on. Actually, a higher share of those are young for their selection year. And essentially the reason is they've had it harder kind of throughout their journey. So they've had to kind of compensate with other skills, both physical and mental. And then when they reach a point where suddenly they're playing with kids who aren't bigger and stronger than them, they've got those other skills more than their opponents, and that gives them an advantage. And so with Harry Kane's a good example of this. He was released by Arsenal as a kid. He was not doing very well at Tottenham, and he was almost released by them as well. And he was born in July, and it was a late physical maturer. And obviously he's now worth a few $100 million. So it also highlights the pitfalls of prematurely selecting and discarding talent, which again links to specialization, which is actually sometimes if you specialize, you might specialize in the wrong sport. And by that I mean, well, you might be 10, 11 and you might be really, really tall for your age, so you think I want to be a basketball player, but actually maybe 4 or 5 years later you haven't really grown and you'd have been better off at another sport, but you've kind of gone too hard too quickly. That's a danger, I think, if you specialize too early.
Because you also make these two other points, which is one is that younger siblings tend to have a better chance of becoming elite sportsmen than the oldest sibling, and that medium-sized towns are very, very good places to grow up if you want to be an elite athlete in any sport. And I think sort of both of those things to me seem to tie into this idea that they make diversity more readily available. I mean, as in sporting, the opportunity to play many different sports, and also having an older sibling is you have less choice about what you want to do. You do whatever your older brothers are doing, right? You sort of follow them around, and you want to compete with them, and they're bigger than you, and they're better than you, and that's a huge advantage to have that to compete with, right?
Yeah, exactly. So in terms of like learning more from failure, if you're playing with an older sibling who's 2, 3, 4 years older than you, you're gonna be losing most of the time, and so you're gonna learn from more from that experience. But also when you're playing with them, you will not be able to physically outdo them. So you've got to develop skills and tricks and mental strength that they just don't need to have, because they can hit the ball further than you or whatever. And the other thing is, if you're a younger sibling, it comes from parents as well. So parents, lots of literature, parents are more relaxed with younger siblings,
Yeah.
and so it tends to be with younger siblings tend to get licensed to kind of play outside and play informally, which tends to be such a big part of an athlete's journey at a younger age. They just get more exposure at an earlier age as well. So it works in a lot of different ways. But I think that the mental strength as well. I mean, there was quotes from A.B. Villiers who played a lot, childhood games with his two older brothers, and they kind of, he says, my brothers were merciless. They were monsters. There were always a lot of tears.
Yeah.
And that's, that was obviously a huge part of his journey, because they were always better than him, and he had to find any way. So it may be, so his older brothers were 6 and 9 years older, which is a lot. But it may be that effectively he was only 3 or 4 years behind them in terms of skill. Well, that actually meant he was a few years above them in real terms. And suddenly, when he gets to the stage where he's playing with kids who aren't bigger and stronger than him, he's got all these brilliant skills that he can bring to bear then. So that, as you said, the sibling effect is huge. And the other point you mentioned was the medium-sized town effect, which is basically that if you're from a medium-sized town, you have far, far, far more chance of becoming an elite athlete. So in the US, if you're born in a town with a population between 50,000 and 100,000, you have 15 times more chance of becoming a professional athlete than children from other areas. So 15 times, that's a massive, massive advantage. Kind of unfathomable, really. That was one of the biggest shocks from the book, just kind of learning about that and also how massive it is. And the reason for the medium-sized town effect, really, it was a few reasons. It's you're in a community where there tends to be, you kind of have the best of a rural and urban existence. So you have the kind of the space of the countryside, but you also have a kind of high quality facilities you might get in a city. You have a level of competition you might get in a city. So you have those together. You also have, again, there's kind of quite a community spirit, and that probably means that parents are more relaxed about their kids playing outside and stuff, which can accelerate development. And also, I think you're kind of less likely to get lost from the system. So actually, the dropout rates in sport are lower in medium-sized and small towns compared to in big towns, because kids kind of don't get lost in the same way. Also, you just have more time to do sport because you don't have to travel so far between. You have more chance to do a range of sports as opposed to just doing one and kind of more pressure to specialize, and then you're spending an hour in the car going home. And also in these sorts of areas, there's often quite a strong tradition of kids who are of promising kids then entering into adults sport at a young age. So we talked with Jeff Lawson from Australia, which has produced a huge amount. Famously had both Mark Taylor and Michael Slater, both Australia's opening pair. They were both from Wagga Wagga, and that's a town of 50,000, which kind of embodies the mid-sized town effect. It's produced huge range of leading athletes. And we talked with Jeff Lawson. He says one of the big facts was when he was 13, he was playing adults men's cricket, which is someone what we hear about kind of grade cricket in Australia. That's a very hardening environment. We talked about those kind of mental skills that you get as a younger sibling. It's massive for all of those things. And actually playing with adults, that can be better, or at least doing that sometimes, than just playing, with kids of your own age. I think that was probably what's a big lesson, I think, for those involved in talent development, was to how can you ensure that your best kids are failing enough, and that can be a case of putting them into older age groups. It can be a case of putting them in adults teams, all of those sorts of things, or even exposing them to other sports where they will fail and have to develop those other skills. So all of those things can be ways of kicking kids on to the next level, so they develop, and rather than just dominating with kids of their own age and then reaching a point where they stagnate because they haven't developed enough.
The one counter example you give is the example of Paris, right? Which is basically a huge metropolitan area with a huge immigrant population and a very diverse immigrant population.
Well, it's interesting. So I went in there as part of research for the book, and actually, if you look at as a metropolitan area, they're actually better understood as self-sufficient areas because of mid-sized towns in their own rights. These kids, they don't tend to come from kind of they're not born, they don't grow up on the Seine or anything. These are these are kind of basically suburb towns of often of 20, 30,000 that would fit as mid-sized towns, where again you have all of their sport will often be within a very small area. So it's not the kind of experience of a kid in New York or whatever who's being lugged around different parts of the city. It's more often a sense of community with a local sports club, and also just being able to play a lot with their friends informally and stuff. That I think so the magic of the kind of Parisian suburbs, what it is, the culture of football there is so big, and the amount of informal play that kids do is so massive. So they're all on local pitches, in parks, between benches, and anything. So just the amount of informal play, which creates athletes are very, very streetwise, basically very creative, very, very creative and streetwise, have made to think for themselves, have done a huge amount of football training, but they haven't just been told what to do by coaches, which I think sometimes is what you see in more affluent kind of parts of bigger cities. The parent, often you have kids and they might do quite a lot of sport, but they'll be doing it in very formal settings.
Yes.
And kind of very good at obeying instructions, not very good at initiative and thinking for themselves. And I think we think 8 of the World Cup of France's World Cup winning squad in 2018 came from the banlieue. So it's an incredible producer of talent, and they typically, almost all these players, they've had a huge amount of informal play growing up, and they have this kind of knowledge of their game and a kind of adaptability as well. That's another thing you get from informal play, because you have, you might be playing, a five-a-side game, and one kid has to go home early, and it's 5v4. Well, actually, that's very difficult for the team who are a man down. There might be parts of the pitch that are dodgy, so you have to find a way of avoiding it. That you'll be playing with bigger kids, older kids, so you have to find ways of dealing with them when you're younger than them or smaller than them. So it exposes you to far more variables than just playing kind of formal under 11 or whatever. And I guess there'll similarities with cricket in Mumbai, for example, where you get kids of different age groups mixing, and that can be very, very good.
Yeah, but that's a charge which is often leveled I've heard it leveled at English players, for instance. That there's whenever there's an English batsman, especially, who comes on and doesn't do too well at test level, the one thing that people often say about such players is that they're overcoached. This used to be a big thing being said about English players, in the early 2000s, and then again in the 13, 14, 15 period, once the Petersons left the scene. But I'm not really convinced that it applies in this case, because now England are doing well, and they're not saying that anymore. And then, I mean, have you looked at this situation, the English international team, not just tests, but also T20, ODI team situation where, today's England team is all about initiative and all about, a cultivated approach, which gives them a license to go after the bowling and to play, assertively. So that's you can't always tell that from watching a player at the international level, can you?
No,
As in it may be true that some players are overcoached and other players have the advantage of a diverse sporting upbringing, playing with many different types of opponents in many different types of sport. But you can't really tell that by looking at an international player in a test match or in a World Cup match or whatever, right?
no, I don't think you could kind of see someone taking over and say, he's played hockey or whatever. Although you can. Ollie Pope, he does sort of credit some of his success to hockey. Steve Smith obviously credits a lot to tennis. So we do see a lot of very successful cricketers.
MS Dhoni credits goalkeeping with his wicket keeping, it seems.
But I think the interesting thing, you talk about the English cricket batsmen, and they're kind of getting some of what we talked about, that diverse multi-skill background. They're getting it almost in a very formal way. And what do I mean by that? I mean, they're going to not just private schools, but some of the most elite schools in the country is actually, frankly, wearing and produce most of their top batsmen now. Ollie Pope, Zach Crawley both went to incredible schools. And they both played a range of sports there. Ollie Pope especially was proficient. So in a way, it's kind of almost a top-down way of getting those advantages. And just the kind of facilities and stuff, and just the amount of exposure to balls and things, which is one of the big issues for kind of English cricket's and its pool of talent, is that there's just a lack of cricket and sport generally in state schools, and that's you create a situation where I think 45% of the England team have come from private schools. That's for 7% of the population. So clearly, that's a team that's not equally open to players from all backgrounds.
It's frightening how good they could be if they could have found a way to get that part of the population to also play cricket. But I want to come to the science of the choke, as you call it, and this is a particularly interesting subject from my point of view, because I've sort of always long wondered why it is that. I mean, I've wondered about this from the point of view of how people who watch react to results and to games, right? But it seems from everything I've talked, every time I talk to some of our common journalist friends, it seems that a lot of this stuff about clutch play and scoring when it matters and playing in the big game and all that is sort of internalized by the players themselves. So the players also seem to believe in this whole idea of mental toughness or whatever other euphemism you might apply and you read commonly in the papers. But you're in part two, you present a different picture of where that difference between the top player and the very good player comes from.
So what do you mean by internalized? You mean
in the sense that they have all adopted that language? They all in their press interviews and all the reporters tell me that when we talk to the players, they talk about clutch players and big game players and this and that a lot more than you might imagine. Whereas you're talking to a lot of these players who are expert, who are describing a completely different process, like Annika Sorenstam or you
Yeah.
know, some of these other players who are describing a completely different process about, how they maintain their levels of, high levels.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, for our chapter on choking, I mean, choking there's such a taboo to it that actually it's very rare to get people to say, yeah, I choked and this is how I choked and everything. So we talked with Scott Boswell, who bowls this, infamous over in the Cheltenham and Gloucester Trophy final in 2001, which
Yeah.
bowls 8 wides or no balls, and it's quite painful to watch actually. And he's very honest about what happens, and he says, I became so anxious I froze. I couldn't let the ball go. And he said, I've been bowling my whole life and it's been fine. Now I can't do it. Basically, how's this happened? And so he says, basically he was overly anxious, and almost he was stuff that his subconscious would normally be able to deal with. He was now having to think of consciously, and that created a kind of a catastrophic collapse in his performance, basically. Yeah. So he was so nervous and he wasn't able to deal with it at all, and this was kind of this over that never ended. And he basically says the bottom line is he didn't trust his action, his skill set. So when it was under high pressure, it collapsed. And that is quite a graphic example of choking. Okay, one interesting thing is, in general, when NBA and WNBA players, have free throws at the end of games that are tight, they're actually more likely to miss than normal, which suggests even the very best athletes, on average, are a little bit affected. So NBA players were 3% less likely to score free throws at the end of tight games, which just in general, athletes are a little bit affected, but clearly the very best athletes are able to avoid this. And I think one of the crucial things, Annika Sorensen's, one of the best female golfers of all time, she talks about this process of disassociating her from the shot, and also the past shot from the next shot. So she, it's an art of being able to kind of analyze what happened in a dispassionate way, and then move on to hitting the next ball or bowling the next ball, whatever sport it is, as opposed to, as Boswell was, one mistake leading on to the other. And the science that, those who are with the highest levels of mental strength have been shown to be best at responding to negative feedback and using it to improve their performance. So it's actually that ability to diagnose what has happened and learn from it instantly, and then to sort of start again. A sport like golf or cricket, or tennis, each action is distinct from the last, and it's recognizing that you have the chance to actually start again. So the bad shot that's happened, or the bad ball, should have no relevance at all on what's about to happen. And a big reason that often it does, one bad ball leads to another bad one, is players want to rush. So, Boswell says he wants to get the over out as quickly as possible. And that's exactly the worst thing to do if you're worried about choking. You have to actually have a consistent process that you stick to each time. So with Annika Sorensen, she says, when she was under most pressure, she felt this kind of tendency, this urge to rush. And actually what she had to do, and did so well, was she had a 24-second routine before each shot, and she would make sure she stuck to it. And so she had this framework, and it means again that every action you enter it from a familiar place. So rather than from getting the ball and rushing it, you're going through the normal process, and that helps to kind of to calm you down, as opposed to the danger of rushing. And another interesting part of the sort of science of choking actually is in how athletes use their eyes. Essentially, when athletes are anxious, they use their eyes less efficiently, and often that means they sort of dart their eyes around everywhere. When athletes do better under pressure, and just better generally, they have what's called a quiet eye, which is they maintain a kind of a sharper and longer fixed focus, typically on the target, or so like in rugby it would be a spot. Often we talked with Dan Carter, and he was talked about he'd always look at a precise spot. He'd find a precise spot in the crowd, and he would keep his eyes on that, and that's a way of maintaining his visual focus as opposed to kind of darting everywhere and looking around, where then you're in real trouble. And a good example of this is penalty shootouts. So when players take less time and they rush, they're more likely to, studies show they become much less likely to score. And actually, with Gareth Southgate, he misses the first penalty in Euro 96. But as England manager before the World Cup of 2018, England did a huge amount of research. We actually have a whole chapter on penalty shootouts because they embody many of the interesting themes. But one of England's takeaways was players had to take a little bit more time, and obviously England did that, and they finally ended their hoodoo by winning a shootout. So none of these are they don't guarantee things, but they improve. Having this consistent method and process increases your chances in a massive way. And I guess the flip side of that is the danger of stereotype threat, which is big relevance for cricket, which is this idea that actually when a group becomes preoccupied with a kind of negative image of their own group, it develops a life of its own, and it then becomes self-perpetuating effectively. So this, the classic study of this is when you tell group of women that they're less before taking a test, that women are less good at maths than men, and women seem to perform less well on maths tests than if they're told before they perform equally well. So being made aware of the stereotype seems to impact whether people will adhere to it or not, and that definitely seems true of South Africa in cricket, where it's become more and more an obsession, a preoccupation, and the players are all different. It's not like Lawrence Guzman-Dawn are still playing, but although the players are all different, this idea has permeated so much, and the players often get very tetchy about the C word and stuff. But it's Gary Curson after 2013 Champions Trophy when he said what happened in previous events was a dark mist that hangs over South African cricket, and I think that's honest, and that shows just how pervasive stereotype threat can be, and how difficult it can be to get out of the rut.
Right, because these are the choke seems to me to be a really harsh case of a much more common phenomenon, which is that as you point out in the book, NBA players do the same skill worse in the towards the end of the game, right? Even in tennis, you see, Roger Federer wins the 15-40 point less often than he wins the 40-15 point, right? And he's the same player, right? And against the same opponents a lot of the time. But it seems to me, from what you describe in the book, that the notion of mastery is the ability to minimize the gap between those things. It is to sort of maintain your process and what you do at all times, or on a larger range of situations than your opponent. And this gets to this idea of expertise. And there's in the old sort of literature on expertise, which comes from discussions about the computational theory of mind, and the debate in philosophy about whether the mind is a computer and in what sense it is a computer. And there was this philosopher, Hubert Dreyfus, who argued that, well, basically, when you master how to drive a car, it's not that, when you're a beginner, when you drive a car, you go through the steps, right? They give you a series of steps, and every time you get before the steering wheel, you follow all the steps. You check the mirror, you check the belt, you put your hands at 10 and 2, and you do you go through the whole ritual, right? But by the time you sort of learn to drive the car, that ritual becomes subconscious. That doesn't mean that you're following those same steps much faster and much more smoothly. It means that you've mastered that process and you've become, and it has become an automatism in a sense. Uh, and it seems to me that in the Boswell example, there's an element of, well, I start worrying about every little thing in my action. That's what it means to lose your action, right? For Boswell, it means that he's now worried about everything. He's worried about his stride. He's worried about his balance. He's worried about, whether he's losing, whether he's going to overstep. All the worries have come to the front of his mind, and that's what it means to sort of lose to let the anxiety get the better of you, right?
Yeah, so the stuff that's natural is now alien and kind of impossible.
Yeah. And you're sort of trying to sort of fall back on your training and go step by step, and that's fatal. That means you can't do that at that level and survive.
Yeah, because you're overthinking things, basically.
And that's also you also sort of allude to this in your discussion about speed, which I found was a very wonderful part of the book. Which and I have come across some of this literature before about how batsmen rarely still watch the ball right onto the bat. Last.
Absolutely, yeah. We have a chapter on how to hit the ball in 0.5 seconds, and that applies to tennis and it applies to baseball and cricket. And in all of those, basically, you cannot. There is not enough time. Like the advice of watch the ball, it's like the worst advice ever. It's impossible.
Yeah.
If you're facing, we talked with Mike Hussey, and he was like, you cannot watch the ball because it's too quickly. So you have to preempt it. And the way you do that is you look at cues from the bowler, because they've done. So in baseball, they did studies where hitters were wearing glasses and they went.
They went blind when the ball was like a certain distance away.
0.15 seconds, and it didn't make any difference to how well they hit the ball because by that point it's too late anyway. So the point is you have to be able to preempt what's going to happen, and that's a case of as a batsman you look at you obviously the bowler well, and then you from the way they shape up you can tell is it going to be a Yorker, bounce a good length, and the way they release the ball. And I mean, this is why actually we think why bowlers can be so hard to face. Jofra Archer would be a good example of someone who doesn't have an obvious tell about when he's going to bowl and especially obviously in the Ashes when he was kind of fairly new on the scene, it was incredibly effective because batsmen just didn't have a way of lining up for how quick. Of lining up where the ball was going to be.
Yeah, a lot of batsmen say that about Jasprit Bumrah as well because of his, slightly odd action.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's again, and that applies to tennis as well. So you see, so Pete Sampras got a brilliant piece of advice that he told us was basically when he was a kid, he'd have a tennis, he would throw the ball up in the air, he would be mid service motion, and his coach would bark at him, line or wide. So either go, either hit the ball down the middle, either serve it down the middle or serve out wide or body, serve it into the body, and that means that he has to develop the ability to serve or do all of those serves without any prior cues in his service motion, because it was too late by that point to change his thing, and that obviously means that when you're facing him, it's incredibly difficult because you can't read someone's serve from how they're lining up. Whereas actually tennis, you see some very good tennis players. Often in the top of tennis, it's not players with the very very fastest serves who are at the very top of the world rankings and stuff, and that's obviously because the rest of their games might not be as good, but we see I think even if you can serve incredibly quickly, if top elite players can read your serve, that gives them that buys them a little bit more time to be able to return it. So yeah, deception is so important at the sort of apex of sport.
But there was another part of the Sampras story which I found really interesting. You write about how Michael Chang was really, really good at reading Sampras's serve. And you also have another story where you talk about Andre Agassi being really good at reading Boris Becker's serve, and becoming good at reading Boris Becker's serve. But then Chang says that, well, Sampras then developed other kinds of serves. Because and that sort of gives you an insight into what makes Sampras a great player, in a sense. That sort of tells you what put Sampras right at the top. It's that he's constantly learning new stuff, and he has this ability to learn new things and to master new things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think in general, as sort of lovers of sport, as watchers of sport, we underrate this massively. We often have an idea that an athlete arrives age 20 and they'll improve on the edges, but they're kind of fully formed. But actually, as you said, that top athletes, they keep on developing new skills, and they're not just their self age 20 is not just 95% version of their peak, who's a bit less consistent or whatever. They can develop fundamentally new skills, and indeed they have to keep on advancing to stay where they are. And I think that's a real kind of hallmark of the very best athletes, is that ability to keep on developing and actually have that that kind of ability to analyze their games and work out what are they less good at and how can they improve.
And they're really good at learning new things. That's not really, not everybody is good at learning new things. Whereas some of these top athletes are, really, really good at mastering new things quickly. I mean, you can see it in Sampras, and you can see it in Federer. And Federer made this point. I listened to an interview of his from last year. He gave an interview to the editor of the New Yorker, David Remnick, and Remnick was saying something about, well, you're mentally tougher than your opponent, and Federer I was very surprised, but his response to that was, well, it's actually not that. It's that I am better at more things than my opponent, so I have more ways to stay in a point than my opponent does. And that's what keeps me in the game longer, and that's what makes it appear as though I am mentally tougher, And it can't be that, Federer knew all of those things when he was 18, right? I mean, those are things he has cultivated over the last 17, whatever, now 20 years almost, right? And that's something that you sort of rarely hear about in the sports pages or in the color commentary. In cricket, our sort of the canonical example of this is Shane Warne. Every series he would come up with a new delivery, and the story was that, well, most of them were all really made up. Like, they were not really new deliveries.
Yeah, I think the story of Steve Smith recently is quite a good example of how a player can develop so much, after arriving at the top level. And I mean, Steve Smith was a joke, and now he's, some people say he's the second best batsman of all time. Not a debate we go down, I'm sure now, but it's.
I would say that.
Well,
on current evidence, it's an arguable point. Yes, I think.
But the point is, he's reached a level which people did not think he had in him at all, and obviously he's managed to keep on developing, keep on advancing. We actually his stance has it changed from his kind of arrival in Test cricket. In fact, became more idiosyncratic, more kind of you were told you weren't meant to do it. So it's been an interesting kind of case study in how, I guess, how players can improve, but also how they can improve through not taking the so-called right path and actually following an individual method.
I want to sort of ask you a cricket specific question here, and it has to do with coaching and it sort of alludes to the chapter on coaching in your book, which is that I've talked to a few coaches now, and they the impression you get talking to them is that there's this whole generational shift going on in cricket where different generations of players in the same team are differently receptive to new methods of coaching, and new and the new directions in which control is shifting, especially in T20, where the coach has a lot of over by over control and tactical control and what have you. uh, what is how do you how do you make sense of that? Is that something that is a phase, and eventually in cricket people will get used to it, and it will be like baseball where the coach is accepted as the boss? Or is there something about the individual and the tension between the individual and the team which will help cricket, which will keep cricket the way it's been so far in the 2000s and such?
So no, it's a very interesting sort of topical point. I think the direction of travel is pretty clear, which is coach. We're having this chat as Delhi have just kind of been hammered in the IPL final, but even so, Ricky Ponting's kind of method as a coach, which is very interventionist, as he says. He sees T20 cricket as basically 240 matchups, and the team who can win the most of those, and actually most importantly almost to get the right matchups as much as possible, is the one who's going to come out on top more often than not. And
right.
And so that seems pretty clear that the future of cricket will look more like that. My sense, though, is that it will not end up quite as far as football along that path. It will be a lot more like it than it is now, but the kind of the vantage point of the captain and the wicketkeeper as well, actually, and a sort of certain gut feel that you can only maybe get from facing the balls and stuff in the game, that will keep cricket a bit distinct to football. But yeah, I think there's a generational thing where players are pretty happy with coaches being more involved, and actually often some welcome it, to be honest. I think that kind of clarity, it can be involved. And I think for coaches, clearly the challenge is it's a balance between good information, not too much information that overwhelms players. And from a skill development point of view, actually, one of the big takeaways from my book is the importance of random training. So training with more variables is so much better than just repetitive training. So so rather than facing 500 balls that are all just 500 balls in the nets and you can do what you like with them, it's much better to break those balls down and say, okay, these balls we are trying, you can only hit to the leg side or something. We're giving you a certain field and you have to hit the ball around that or whatever. That is going. All the research that's got evidence suggests that more focused method, it will actually keep training less stale as well, and kind of more dynamic. And if you're just repeating things again and again and again, that's might kind of maintain your level, but it's unlikely to improve it. And again, you're not going to be exposed to as many variables as possible. And then another crucial thing is actually trying to make training even harder than the game itself. So we talked with Elena Del Don, who's one of the best ever women's basketball players of all time, but she's also the best free throw shooter in men's or women's basketball of all time. And she talks about how she always, she has to end each session with 10 free throws that are successful in a row. She practices 3 throws the most when she is at her most tired as well in training. And that actually means that, again, you talked about, it links to choking a little bit. And it means that when she's taking a free throw and she's tired at the end of a big playoff game, well, obviously the game itself will be a unique experience, but the fact of taking a free throw when she's tired, at least that's not different as well. She's used to that. So again, that's reducing some of what's new about a high pressure situation in a real match, and therefore the amount that can go wrong, and it means her performance is more likely to be able to hold up under that sort of pressure.
I mean, I have this image of, especially in the T20, which is only 240 balls. I have this image of all the IPL franchises knowing exactly which matchups they desire and which boundaries they're going to defend on each matchup. And if they're batting, then which boundaries they're going to look to target for each matchup, for each of the 240 deliveries. And I can imagine someone like Kohli or Smith or, some of these captains, like absolutely having mastered that material before they get onto the pitch. Because, that's just, you can just imagine them being, highly, highly, highly motivated to be very, very well prepared for those things.
But there's also, I wonder in T20 we're going to reach the point where you're right, everyone knows the right matchup, and the opponents also know the matchup that the other team wants to kind of act on, or whether there's a value in doing the anti-matchup thing at some point. So to give a test analogy, if your best serve is down the line on 30-40, but your opponent knows that, and he knows it so well that actually sometimes maybe you're better off doing your less good serve because it won't be quite as good, but the value of surprise will actually outweigh a slightly inferior serve. And so I think they will, as much as we can go down that road, the value of doing something which isn't expected, there will also be a value in that as well.
Yes, I mean, as sort of expectations are catalogued so systematically, you do wonder what second order effects that's going to have, right?
So, I mean, if you're bowling to a batsman and your premise of your line of attack or defense as a T20, we should probably call it, is he can't hit the ball over short fine leg. He doesn't have those shots. Well, actually, if you take on that shot, they might not think you're capable of doing it, but maybe you can pull it off, and it might be that because they don't think you're capable of it, they give you actually more margin for error than they would a batsman who they respected more on that shot. So does it actually become a better option for you if you're inferior at it in a funny sort of way?
Yeah. It would be interesting, especially if we could see what the expectations are. But that sort of probably just if the audience of the cricket broadcast was me, then that would be interesting. I'm not really sure it would be interesting for everybody. But I mean, speaking of all this, your chapter on Barcelona was quite eye-opening to me. I mean, you're basically describing a club which, turns its players into, actors in a video game, and they're tracking them all the time in all sorts of ways.
Yeah, so that was written by my colleague Mark, who visited La Masia, so he would have been a bit better placed to chat about it than me. But essentially, it's looking at the ways in which Barcelona are trying to kind of be at the cutting edge of future developments in football and sport more generally, and a big part of that is kind of empowering their athletes into thinking more deeply and into developing their kind of ability to analyze the game and work out what's happening, and that's using things like virtual reality, looking at player tracking, things like that, and working on actually how to there's some interesting some number of football clubs have these kind of, they're looking at improving the cognitive functions of their players, so their decision making under pressure, and that can be done with video games as well as on the pitch itself. And obviously with the brain, you don't have the finite limit of he can only train on the football pitch for 3 hours, he can only bowl 8 overs if he's a fast bowler or whatever in the net. So you actually have, I think potentially there's a lot more that can be done here, and you can do this for a lot more than you can do the physical training. And it's obviously decision making under pressure is such a fundamental part of what it takes to be an elite athlete.
Yes, I mean, and that sort of, I know when I read the Barcelona chapter, I sort of decided that we had to start this conversation at the gap, with the gap between sort of the best and the next level. And if someone who plays for Barcelona is going to have that level of that level of training and that level of facility, then the player in the second division is 2 years of that gap is going to sort of increase the gap between the second division player and the Barcelona player tremendously, isn't it?
Yeah, that's definitely right, and I think it also shows that, again, that's something I think we can underestimate. It's obvious, but I think we can underestimate in the kind of popular media how focused leading teams are on improving their players. So they're not seeing even a 25-year-old athlete. They're not seeing him as a kind of fixed asset.
Finished.
Yeah, they're not seeing him as a finished article. But also they have a kind of more optimistic sense of what his ceiling can be as an athlete. They don't put a kind of artificial limit on this. And actually, there was a book called The MVP Machine, which is good on baseball, and it's basically arguing that a generation ago the inefficiency was in identifying talent and identifying players' value. Now the inefficiency is in how well two teams can take players who are equally good and what the players look like after a few years, and that's to do with improvement. And actually, to take this conversation back to cricket and T20 is the big thing for me is Mumbai Indians have the best T20 team in the world, fantastic, but are they doing enough? And does the current structure of the sport allow them to do enough with their players for the 9.5 months a year when they're not playing the IPL? And I think that for any T20 franchise who's serious about the kind of sporting integrity and the kind of the value of winning as opposed of winning cricket matches, this is such a big area. How can you help players improve when they're not playing for you in this very short tournament? And if you can do that, well, you find a way of adding value to your players massively, and therefore you're going to be better. I think that is a huge area for D20 franchises around the world if they're serious about winning and to really focus on.
Well, Tim, this has been a lot of fun. I think when I read the book, and I recommend I'll recommend the book to all the listeners, and I'll also link the excerpt which came out in the Guardian in the show notes. But one of the thing I got from this book was not just a wonderful survey of what it means to be the best in the world at your sport, but the very strangeness of being the best in the world at your sports. That at how far removed from our lives that kind of life is, and that kind of excellence is, and there's something a little bit unsettling in that gap, and then in the idea that gap might be growing. So if nothing else, that to sort of get an insight into that, it's worth I think reading this book carefully. So thank you very much, Tim.
Thanks, Karthika. That was great. Always a pleasure to chat.